There is a specific kind of silence that you only find up north. It isn't the empty silence of a quiet room or the late-night lull of a suburban street. It is a heavy, ancient silence, the kind that feels like it has weight, pressing against the windows of old timber cabins. When you're 13, you don't have a name for it. You just know that when the sun goes down behind the pines, the world changes. The loons on the lake stop sounding like birds and start sounding like something mourning under the ice, and every creak of a floorboard feels like a heartbeat that isn't yours. This is the story of a night in a cabin that should have been a sanctuary, but instead became the site of a physical paradox, a moment where a shadow wasn't just a trick of the light, but a presence with mass. My brother and I were staying with our grandparents, and it was one of those classic up-north vacations, the kind where the air smells like wood smoke and damp cedar. We were set up in a back bedroom, sleeping in bunk beds. I was on the top bunk, closer to the ceiling fans and the rising heat. He was on the bottom. To keep the total darkness at bay, our grandparents had plugged in a small, dim nightlight near the doorway. It was a weak, amber thing that barely managed to illuminate the grain of the wood, casting long, distorted shapes across the floor. I remember drifting in that shallow space between waking and dreaming when the air in the room suddenly felt cold, not just chilly, but localized, like a freezer door had been left open nearby. Then came the whisper, "Someone is here." My brother's voice was thin, vibrating with a panic that instantly cut through my drowsiness. I didn't want it to be true. My 13-year-old brain immediately tried to gate the sensory input, to rationalize the fear away. "It's just a dream," I whispered back, staring at the dark ceiling. "Go back to sleep." But he persisted. He wasn't just scared, he was certain. "Take a look," he begged. "Please, just look." Reluctantly, I leaned over the edge of the top bunk. The nightlight was still flickering, and in its weak glow, standing exactly in the center of the doorway, was a silhouette. It was a man, or at least the shape of one, over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered and impossibly black. It wasn't dark like a person standing in a shadow. It was a void. It was a blacker-than-black mass that seemed to absorb the amber light from the hallway, a generic shadow phenotype that parapsychologists often call a watcher. At first, my heart simply stopped. There is a physiological reaction to seeing something that your brain tells you cannot exist, a tipping point where fear becomes a cold, physical weight in your chest. My first instinct was still to rationalize. I told myself it must be a shadow cast from something in the hall, a trick of the pareidolia, where our minds fill in the blanks of a chaotic environment to see a human form. "I'll hit it," I whispered, more to convince myself than my brother. I reached down, and my brother passed me one of our foam slippers. I held it for a second, feeling the mundane weight of the blue fabric. In every ghost story I had ever heard, spirits were vapor, they were mist, they were things you could walk through. I expected the slipper to sail through the figure and clatter against the hallway floor. I'm proving once and for all that we were just two kids getting worked up by the silence of the woods. I wound up and threw the slipper as hard as I could. The sound it made wasn't the clack of wood, it was a thud. The slipper didn't pass through the darkness. It hit something solid. It hit the chest of that 6-foot void with the distinct sound of impact against mass. The slipper bounced off the shadow and fell to the floor. The figure didn't flinch. It didn't move. It just stood there, a physical impossibility anchored in the doorway. We lost our minds. The scream that left us was primal. Within seconds, the cabin was a blur of motion. My parents and grandparents burst into the hall, flipping on every light. My grandfather, a man of the north who didn't believe in ghosts but believed very much in intruders, he'd searched the house with a flashlight and a heavy hand. They called the police. When the officers arrived, they did a forensic sweep of the perimeter. They checked the deadbolts, locked from the inside. They checked the windows, latched. They searched the saved house, the basement, and the tree line. The conclusion was the same every time. No one was there. No footprints in the fresh dirt. No disturbed dust on the sills. No signs of forced entry. To the authorities, this was a forensic void, a case of shared imagination between two tired kids. But for us, the slipper hit changed everything. In psychology, psychology, there is a concept called folie à deux, the madness of two, where a delusion is transmitted from one person to another. Skeptics would say my brother induced the vision in me, and my brain, primed by fear and the dim light, I created the figure. But folie à deux doesn't account for Newtonian physics. It doesn't account for the force, F equals m times a, of a slipper hitting a solid object. Shadow people are often reported to have variable density, while most are fleeting, peripheral shapes. A rare subset of encounters involves entities that are three-dimensional and impenetrable. Some theorists suggest these are interdimensional intersections, higher dimensional beings whose cross-section in our world appears as a light-consuming shadow, yet maintains atomic mass. When that slipper hit the figure, it wasn't hitting a ghost. It was hitting the boundary of something our science doesn't yet have a name for. The aftermath of an event like this is what stays with you. It's called disconfirmed reality. When you see something, feel something, and hear the impact of it. But every adult and authority figure tells you it was just a dream. It creates a lingering hypervigilance. You grow up, but you never quite stop looking at doorways. You never quite trust the silence. Decades later, my brother and I still talk about it. We don't talk about it as a ghost story. We talk about it as a forensic fact. We know that in a cabin up north, in a room lit by a flickering amber light, we encountered something that was both there and not there. We hit the void, and for one terrifying second, the void was solid. So, the next time you find yourself in the north, and the woods go quiet, and you see a shape in the corner of your eye that seems just a bit too dark, don't just look away. Because sometimes the shadows aren't just an absence of light. Sometimes they are a presence of something else entirely. And if you throw something at them, they might just stay standing.